thank you again for being here tonight. Thanks to Hennepin County Library for their continued partnership with us. We are also really grateful to the panelists who are here tonight this evening, and to those of you who decided to spend your evening with us. More Than a Single Story is a Twin Cities-based public conversation series where Black, Indigenous, and people of color writers, artists, and activists discuss issues of importance to us. Our goal is to provide a forum that strengthens our abilities to work together around cross-cultural understanding and to add to the discussions of empowerment in and for our communities. We are pleased with our ongoing partnerships with Hennepin Libraries, the Friends of the St. Paul Library, the Loft Literary Center, and other partners. We are extremely grateful to the voters of Minnesota for grants from the Metro Regional Arts Council and the Minnesota State Arts Board, and for support from other foundations, all of which allow us to keep our programs going. As Kia mentioned, we did publish an anthology last year with University of Minnesota Press, which is being featured now in this as the One Book, One Minnesota, and we'll have our culminating event, a virtual event tomorrow night. The registration will be in the chat box. So we invite you to visit our website or sign up for our monthly newsletter to stay up to date with our events. I am very excited about tonight's conversation with two distinguished chefs, Sean Sherman and Yia Vang, and two amazing notable food writers, Mecca Boss and Natalia Mendez, who will engage us in a conversation on the historical and contemporary issues around food in their communities, and some of the ways that food serves as a backdrop for celebrations in their communities. As Kia mentioned, there will be a Q&A following the discussion, and we'd like for you to fill out an evaluation. Now, excuse me, before we begin, More Than a Single Story always starts our public conversations with a poem based on the topic of the day's conversation. I am pleased that tonight's poem will be read by a dear friend of both mine and Mecca Boss's. And I would like to introduce Zenobia Silas Carson. She's a writer, a teacher, a speaker, and a minister and a senior life coach. She's a retired teacher who worked with special needs children in Brooklyn Park, and she has also worked as an advocate at Harriet Tubman Women's Center and Incarnation House in Minneapolis. Most recently, she held positions at Lang Nelson Associates as an office assistant, activities director, and exercise coach for senior women, and leader of several food programs at Creekside Gables, which is a 55+ senior community in Brooklyn Park. She encourages people as a minister and is involved in sharing resources for food services through Good in the Hood and CEAP. She also remains involved in writing workshops and enjoys activities with her children, her grandchildren, and her great-grandchildren. So Zenobia, please share your poem with us.
Thank you, Carolyn. I chose a poem by Maya Angelou. She's not only one of my favorite writers, but this poem suggests that she's thinking about her down home ties and her down home food and the food that makes her most comfortable. It is the health food diner. No sprouts of wheat and soya sprouts, no Brussels in a cake. Carrot straws and spinach pilau. Today I need a steak. No thick brown rice and rice pilau or mushrooms creamed on toast. Turnips mashed and parsnips smashed. I'm dreaming of a roast. Health food folks around the world are thin to anxious zeal. They look for help in seafood kelp. I'm counting on breaded veal. No smoking signs, raw mustard greens, zucchini by the ton, uncooked kale and bodies frail are sure to make me run to loins of pork and chicken thighs and standing ribs so prime. Pork chops brown and fresh ground round, I crave them all the time. Irish stews and boiled corned beef and hot dogs by the tons, or any place that saves a place for smoking carnivons.
Thank you, Zenobia. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists for the evening. Sean Sherman is Oglala Lakota, born in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. He has been cooking across the US and the world for the last 30 years. His main culinary focus has been on the revitalization and awareness of Indigenous food systems in a modern culinary context. In 2014, he opened the Sous Chef as a caterer and food educator to Minneapolis-St. Paul area. In 2015, in partnership with the Little Earth community of United Tribes of Minneapolis, he helped design and open the Tatanka food truck. In 2021, Chef Sean and Dana Thompson opened Owamni by the Sous Chef, a modern Indigenous full-service kitchen located in Minneapolis's North Loop. Owamni features the true foods of North America through an Indigenous perspective. Sean's vision of modern Indigenous foods has garnered many awards, including a number of awards for his cookbook, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen, which was published in 2017. And he also won the prestigious James Beard Award, which named Owamni the best new restaurant in the United States in 2022. So we welcome Sean Sherman. And then we are expecting any minute Yia Vang, so I'll go ahead and introduce him as well. Yia Vang is a trained chef and Beard Foundation Award finalist. He worked at many top restaurants in the Twin Cities before opening Union Hmong Kitchen. He has been featured in the New York Times, National Geographic, and Bon Appetit, as well as showcased on PBS, CNN, the Food Network, Netflix's Iron Chef, The Quest for an Iron Legend, and more. In 2022, he was a semi-finalist for the James Beard Foundation's Best Chef Midwest Award. His new Minneapolis restaurant concept, Vinai, is named after the refugee camp in Thailand, where he was born. His restaurants create a home for his Hmong cuisine, celebrate his parents' legacy, and share the story of his family through food. Union Hmong Kitchen, located in Gray's Food Hall in North Loop, Minneapolis, features Hmong culture, stories, rituals, foods, and flavors. Vang marries traditional traditions with those from back home in South and Eastern Asia to bring Hmong flavors to American palates. Next, we have Mecca Boss, who has been a Twin Cities-based journalist and chef for more than 20 years. In those dual roles, she has become known as one of the leading local voices for marginalized voices in the food community and has championed the uplifted stories of people of color, women, elders, and immigrant communities, putting focus and spotlight on stories that the mainstream media has traditionally overlooked and ignored. Mecca has been the dining critic of Twin Cities Metro and City Pages, and her work has also been published in the New York Times, Taste, Vice, Paste, Travel and Leisure, Midwest Living, and many other publications. She's a regular contributor to Minnesota Public Radio, and is producing her own audio documentary work, Hidden Black Foodways. Through the BIPOC Foodways Alliance, Mecca, Sean Sherman, and their community of allies plan to dismantle white supremacy using food as a tool. Based in the Twin Cities and around the world, BIPOC Foodways Alliance is dedicated to the documentation, examination, and promotion of the foodways of all BIPOC communities in the United States. Then we have Natalia Mendez. Their pronouns are they and them. They are a queer Chicanx writer and photographer living in Minneapolis. Finding connections to their roots and with others through food has been a habit throughout their life. They can also be found around the Twin Cities on two wheels, either a bicycle or a motorcycle, when they're not writing about food, entertainment, the outdoors, or experiences on the margins. Their work is published regularly on their blog with The Current. You can also find their work on racketminnesota.com, Eater Twin Cities, Seward Co-op's website, and more, as well as on their website. Finally, I will introduce our moderator, Tess Montgomery. Tess is a young communicator, a visionary, and an avid foodie who lives in Minneapolis. She is a media planner at Preston Spire. She was a 2018 fellow with the Josie R. Johnson Leadership Academy, a 2017 fellow with New Sector Academy, and served as programming chair of Young Nonprofit Professionals Network of the Twin Cities. Tess is passionate about the power of grassroots community-led organizing. She holds a degree in journalism and mass communications from Drake University. In 2019, she was named one of 15 up-and-coming PR and social media marketers to watch. Her essay, Financial Trauma in Communities of Color, was published in Minnesota Women's Press in 2020 and in We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World. So now I will turn it over to Tess.
Thank you. And again, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I'm really excited about this conversation. As you mentioned, I've worked in the realm of food for many years, working with Appetite for Change and Breaking Bread Cafe, doing their communications and marketing work, but also just working in the food industry as a server, host, you name it, since my college years and to this day. So very, very important and fun, exciting topic for me. And yeah, if Yia comes, he comes, but we might have to miss his presence this afternoon or evening. Very busy man, as you can imagine, with all the stuff we've got going on. But yeah, I'm excited for this conversation because a lot of the work and the framework around food and people of color has always kind of been from a negative connotation standpoint. You talk about food deserts, barriers to access, and health issues that come from the food we enjoy, and down to the colonization of our plates. So it's really exciting to kind of twist that conversation around and talk about how food can be exciting, important, and just all around part of our culture. So that's kind of the basis of this conversation this evening, with these food writers and chefs and just food advocates as well. So with that, I will start with the first question, and just feel free to soak on it and then kind of speak when you're ready. Is identify how colonization has impacted your food culture and what efforts have you seen in your culture to reclaim what was stolen. And that can be however you identify culture and however you relate as well. But yeah, how is colonization? Like, what is the history there? Walk us through that history and the reclamation that we've seen to date.
I'll start. A lot of the work that I started with, coming from a tribal community, growing up with the Oglala Lakota Sioux tribe in Pine Ridge in South Dakota, and just being around an indigenous community throughout my youth. And then later, moving away from the indigenous community and working in restaurants, and kind of growing up in restaurants. So I've been cooking since I was 13. But this work has really kind of forced me to realize the absence of indigenous foods. When I kind of had the epiphany of doing the work I'm doing, was just realizing that there was no Native American anything out there. There was no restaurants. There was very few books on the subject. And it made me just try to understand, what my ancestry foodways, what that meant. And as I studied that and learned it, it really became a study of not only how my ancestors were eating and surviving, but it also became a study in what happened to us as indigenous peoples, which really became a study of colonialism, and American colonialism in particular. So we can study European colonialism and Eurocentric colonialism, which happens across the globe. My focus has primarily been on the American colonialism that happens from the 1800s forward. So for me, I always try to showcase and identify what the term colonialism means, which is just the policy or practice of acquiring full or partial political control over another country, occupying with settlers and exploiting it economically. And what that means is basically, in simplest terms, is extraction for profit and land grabbing and, everything that goes along with it. So what happens in the United States is, in what is the United States today, is an extremely violent history, but it also happens across the Americas too, and it's happening everywhere. It's happening in Africa and India and Southeast Asia, Australia, New Zealand. So we have all of these groups of diverse indigenous peoples from all over the globe affected by colonialism, And it's still happening today. Like they are still like removing and murdering and stealing land from indigenous peoples in the Amazon in Brazil right now today, for example, and it's happening elsewhere. But for here in America, it's really understanding for us, and especially because Mecca and I have so many conversations, especially when it comes to Black and Indigenous and people of color in general. We are always looking at the story of white supremacy and colonialism and how it's still very much alive systematically. And there's just so much work to do to begin to dismantle that in each of our own cultures. But it's important for us all to come to the table literally and really bring stories and bring solutions to move forward to how do we stand out, how do we get past all of that muck of violence in the past and all that trauma that happens to us, and the dismantling of the cultures that happen to us in our own families, and how do we work towards reclamation of becoming something different moving forward. So it's all those pieces to me is how we kind of start to begin to understand.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that how it's affected me as a Black woman chef is that after 20 years of working in this industry, I realized I didn't really have a food identity of my own. And I think that's a direct result of colonialism, because, we are, whether, how much you want to embrace and then celebrate African-American cuisine which is a wonderful, amazing cuisine that was evolved throughout the 400 years that we've been here. But when it comes down to it, we're indigenous people of Africa who were forcibly removed from our homeland and brought here forcibly. And, we're able to retain some of our culinary histories and such. But, I recently had a chef over at my house who's Nigerian. And while you see some of the similarities of African cuisine, it was also very different. And so I think that, being able to reclaim the foodways of Africa and of my true roots is something that is going to be like an ongoing effort. And I think that it's a worthy endeavor, but I think that's is a direct result of colonialism as well for all Black people in America.
Yeah, just kind of circle back to some of the stuff Sean was saying. So I'm Mexican. A lot of my roots are pre-colonial in America before it was America. And when I think about its impact on my food culture, I think of the more present day impacts that we've seen in lots of Black and Brown communities, how our kind of indigenous food structures have changed to ones that were more processed. We got like kind of leftover bits to work with, higher I just look at my family and I see like a lot of diabetes and stuff in the family, just like unhealthy, our lifespans are cut short because we kind of get the leftovers, or we're not given access to the things that we traditionally used. And I see that as like a negative impact in the food culture, but as a means to reclaim what was stolen, like I really look to, I'm like a big fan of Catrionia Rueda Iscabel and Luz Calvo, who did Decolonize Your Diet. So they spent a lot of time and they did a lot of research to like veganize lots of these Mexican dishes and stuff. So I'm trying to find a way to reconnect with my culture that was a little more pre-colonial, a little bit healthier, and a way to kind of access those flavors that I grew up with in a way that is, I don't know, just coming back to what feels a little more natural and a little less processed, and again, a lot more indigenous as well. And it looks like Yi is here, so I don't want to take up too much time. If we could say hi to him.
Hi, Yi.
No,
Thank you.
I am so sorry. Our dinner was like taking forever, and I feel
good.
horrible.
You're good.
So I'm like I'm driving while trying to do all this, but yeah, I'm kind of dark right now.
All is well. If it makes you more comfortable, feel free to go off camera if you wanted to. Not that you have to, but if you wanted to. We just definitely appreciate your voice.
No, I apologize. I'm going to go off camera because I'm going to go into my house. I'll keep talking, but I'm going to go into my house and keep talking. But I think that this is something that I think all the time you know, especially when it comes to especially when it comes to monk food, because it's this idea that, you know, the way that we make monk food, the way that we eat monk food, you know, everybody, you know, a lot of my white friends always go, oh yeah, it's family style, you're doing it family style. And I'm like, it's not a style, like this isn't like a trend we're trying to do, but this is how we eat. You know, I mean, even the way that we eat, I really think about that idea of when even the way that the food is served, there's everything's put in the center. You know, like I was just telling somebody that I growing up, when I went to my white friend's house, like their mom and their dad be like, hey, let me make you a plate, let me make you a plate. But in our culture, in the way that we eat, it's never been about making somebody a plate. You never make somebody a plate. It would almost be it would almost be a travesty if you made somebody a plate. But you give them a plate and then you invite them to the table, and then in the center where all the food is, that's our way of saying, hey, like, this is where you come in, this is you belong here. And the way that we've been taught to eat, the way that we've been taught even to plate our food, it's very Eurocentric. You know, how we put everything on that plate and we make it look good, you know, and how everything is on that plate. And even you think about how the plate is set up, it limits what can be brought into it. And so it's something where I had to like reverse engineer my mind. Like, you know, I grew up cooking in, you know, like kind of these French-based restaurants, you know. So it was, for me, it was just this whole thing of like trying to reverse engineer everything that I've learned to really embrace it. Because the honest truth, I was like always really embarrassed on how we ate at home. And then it wasn't until probably like 5-6 years ago when I truly embraced and said, there's a deeper, richer way of the way that we eat. And, you know, and I don't know. So that's, you know, the first thing I think about is that aspect of it, and how, you know, just even every motion or every dish that we eat, like the purpose of it and how that explains the story of our people.
Absolutely. Even in thinking about this conversation, I was thinking about a friend, Amani, who has done a lot of reclaiming, and she's a Black Jewish woman, and she kind of broke down the Seder plate. I don't even know if I was saying that wrong, but just how like literally that plate during Passover is meant to tell the food history, which was really important to her to explain that. And I think that's very similar for a lot of things that we eat and put into our bodies, especially when it comes from our own cultures. Which kind of leads me to my next question in line of thinking is, how do we triumph when we are reclaiming our food and our food history? What does that mean for us internally? And what does it mean to you for your culture and people that might be in the same position? And I also kind of got me thinking about, you know, like you said, sitting down family style, it's not a trend. It's not something to just make light of, like, this is our culture, this is the way we do it. But now in the nature of social media and TikTok, food has become a lot of trends, and people's important cultural food has just become a trend, and people try to recreate it or try and make light of it. So is that an honor, or is that just super cheesy and corny? You know, the birria trend, tamales might pop off next, or sitting down family style. I've seen lots of TikToks where they just dump food on a table, whether it be spaghetti or whatever, to eat with their hands and such. So yeah, what's the line of, one, reclaiming it, and two, food becoming a trend, food that's cultural and very important to our cultures becoming a trend? If you need clarification on that, let me know, but yeah.
So, you know, for me, that's obviously, it's a big topic with a lot of the indigenous food sovereignty movement that's going on across the United States, of people trying to reclaim some of their food heritage, and just trying to decide, you know, what are some rule structures around these pieces, and, you know, how safe is it to normalize these foods for other cultures? Because like, what happens if people start to capitalize? Because that's what Americans have done best, is basically bastardize every single culture and cuisine that's out there in some form or another. So how do we prevent that? I think it's really important that we allow people who are from these communities to be able to tell these stories around these foods and to really celebrate those foods in that fashion. I think it's really important that we have this time in history as people of color to really just identify what it means to have our foods moving forward outside the colonial space, because we've grown up in such a colonial structure that's been extremely racist, extremely segregating to so many of us, and stacked against us completely in every single mannerism, whether it's financial or land access or nutritional access or education. And, we really have to push back against that, because the first step is just looking at our education process, because if we all a lot of us went to American schools where we're taught to celebrate colonial history, which is insane, because they skip over the extreme violence that happens to so many groups of people for this mad rush for gathering land spaces and wealth. And we just have to really take the time to understand how powerful food is as a language that we can all really utilize together. And especially as people of color, to be able to come together, to be able to share food, be able to share thoughts and ideas, to see these commonalities that we have amongst ourselves, our families, and our histories because of primarily Eurocentric colonialism, and really just trying to understand how do we break free from those confines? How can we find resources to build restaurants and make things well known, so I feel very lucky that we have like Yia and I and Mecca and people just are beginning to get some resources and some platforms to be able to have a voice, to be able to talk about things that our parents couldn't do, or our grandparents didn't have the chance to, and so forth. Like there's so much that has to happen, and it's really just setting up this next generation to really claim their food, and to really call people out when it starts to get bastardized. And obviously we can't stop a TikTok trend if it happens. So I feel like that is what it is. And I think we have other things to worry about.
Yeah, for me, as far as reclamation is concerned, one thing that I've noticed in my career as a food writer is that like the food media all but ignores stories of particularly elders, and particularly elders of color. And when I interview a chef, which is most times I would probably have to say a man, I oftentimes ask, how they got into cooking or what inspired them. And they almost always across the board say their mother or their grandmother, or their auntie in some cases. And so I've started to pay attention to some of those stories. And I did a story with Yia's mom at her home, where she taught us a traditional Hmong dish, and it was super fun and super interesting. And so what I'm thinking about in terms of reclamation is one of the projects that we're going to hope to do with BIPOC Foodways Alliance is start to give people like that a platform for their food, because the food media loves restaurants, the food media loves dudes, food media loves young men. And we all but ignore many swaths of culinary knowledge and deep culinary knowledge. And I heard it written once by another food writer who said, we pay attention to what we value in our society. So we want to, create a table where people can come in and tell their stories about food, which are oftentimes oral. They're oftentimes not written. If you go into many people's kitchens, you can attest to this with your mother. She doesn't write down her recipes, she cooks her recipes. And if you want to learn, you better get in the kitchen with her. So I think like allowing people to tell their own stories. If you go back even a decade, the large majority of food writers, food critics were white people, white women and white men, distilling culture through their viewpoint, and through their lens, which, as we know, just really doesn't always work out very well. So I think like listening to people and listening to people who have the culinary knowledge within them, and not dismissing people who are oftentimes really the source. So that's something that we're hoping to do with BIPOC Foodways Alliance, and I hope people will follow us on Instagram to see how that unfolds in the coming year.
Yeah, can you just give a brief overview of what the BIPOC Food Alliance is?
Yeah, well, I think the hope is that we're going to find a space in 2023 where we have a table. It'll be a small space, something up to 12 people. And we'll invite people from the community, oftentimes, most of the time, people who don't already have a platform. So people who don't already have a restaurant, and who don't already have a book deal. Like I said, there'll be a deep focus on women and women of color, and bring them in to allow them to tell their stories through food, and help curate the dinner for them, help cook to whatever capacity they want. And then we hope to document those stories through audio, through visuals, through video, through photos, and just both as a gift to the individual and their family, but also to the entire community. And we'll do some other things as well, but that's the vision for 2023. And we'll be doing a variety of things with that.
Perfect. Thank you for that. But yeah, Natalia, what are your thoughts on reclaiming and also trends? But first and foremost, reclaiming, because that's what's most important.
Yes. So when it comes to reclaiming our food culture, I think a lot about how I got to where I am today with my, not just like my food career, but my interest in food in general. And it had to do with my uncle Sal, who's no longer with us. He was a restaurateur in Milwaukee. He had a restaurant called Sempasuchi that was Oaxacan food. He specialized in moles. And when I was a really little kid, he gave me this book. I think it was called like The Tree That Reigns, that had to do with the Huichol people in northwestern Mexico. And he told me, like, I still have this book and it's very special to me. He got me my first cookbook too, and my first measuring spoons and stuff too. And the inside it just said, like, don't forget where you come from. And when I think about this, when we reclaim our food history, we need people like us in our communities to bring people in of any age. But I was particularly grateful as a young person to have access to that, because I guess, again, in Mexican culture, there's this caste system that has to do with lots of colorism and racism. And I feel like that indigenous history of Mexico is often thrown away or forgotten. And often I'm second generation Mexican American. When my grandmother immigrated, she had a very difficult time in America with her thick accent. So a lot of it was assimilate, make my children's lives easier. We speak English in this house. And when we reclaim our food history, it gives us access in ways that if we lost a language, perhaps, we can have access to cultural traditions, because I have very rusty Spanish, but I have access to recipes from my grandparents and their parents and everyone that came before because of these food traditions. So I think that is the triumph of reclaiming our food histories, whether it's our parents, our grandparents, or even, like, again, Uncle Sal, rest in peace. I've had this like obsession with corn since I was a child because of the story in this book that he gave me. And I think that is like the triumph, is getting young people or any person interested in where they come from through food, because we all need it. But it creates the sense of belonging that I think is perhaps one of the most accessible ways, because we can enjoy it with all of our senses. And as far as food, what was, I'm sorry, can you remind me, Tess, what the kind of second question was there?
Well, it was just kind of surrounding food trends. Like, birria has become a huge trend since the pandemic. And I was thinking even before then, like probably egg rolls became a huge trend and are now just, a common food. And I'm failing to think of the other ones, eating at the table or sitting down or with your hands. Yeah, it's becoming a trend, but it's also being mocked, but it's also being, is it being recolonized through this, or is it bringing exposure? Like, what are your thoughts around that in general?
Geez, I think when I was younger, I would have been really, I have very mixed feelings about this, because I think it allows people to have access to a culture they otherwise would not, but it makes me concerned, like, at which way, like, how deeply are you willing to dive into this culture beyond just the food? Are you only accessing it for this one thing that you think is like tasty, and then that's it? Yeah, I think it's good as a gateway, but I would encourage others to look deeper. And then also, I don't know, beyond that, like, kind of like I said earlier, some of the food that's very popular is a colonized version of it to begin with. And just, you can enjoy it. It is an evolution of these pre-colonial foods. And I would encourage people to be critical about it and curious about the culture overall, and respectful. Yeah, I don't know. Go ahead. Yeah, you look like you're ready.
Oh no, I mean, this is exactly there was a food writer last week and we were talking about this is exactly what we were talking about, right? It's the closed hand, open hand theory. Like we close and we hold on to our traditions and like these things that for thousands of years our people, for me and Hmong people, been fighting for and been wanting them to say this is what we're gonna take. We this is us, but then we have to be open because progress is forward. And so yeah, so like I think that it's like this thing that I keep we keep talking about in our restaurant is like if that every dish has a narrative, and if you follow that narrative long enough and close enough, you get to the people behind the food, and once you're there, it's not about food, it's actually about people, and the food is this catalyst into cultivating great relationships. Like it's so crazy when I tell people that oh yeah, we make fried chicken, and they're like, wait, what? Like Hmong people make fried chicken. I'm like, dude, fried chicken is not like just the South. And like a lot of cultures make fried chicken. Like the concept of putting, putting meat and breading it and then putting it in deep fry oil, like that's just not like a like American South thing. That is like a world thing. And so like for when I said that, people were just like, these friends were like, well, I just never thought about it that way. But then one of the things that I love is that like we get to be, and I see this through the lens of Hmong food, but like I get to be, and I see myself as not an ambassador of Hmong food, but a steward. That long before I came here, there was somebody else that was a steward of it, and it was passed down to the next group, and it was passed down to the next group, and that's what I love about being Hmong. Like I learned about what it truly means to be Hmong farming with my mom. And I remember we were sitting out in the garden and I'm like, Mom, there's a section in that garden where it's like, it looks overgrown. And it's I'm like, why are we harvesting that? And my mom said to me, she goes, son, we don't harvest that section of the garden because we let it overgrow. We let the plants actually die. And so we can gather the seeds. And then in those seeds, that's next season's growth. And I really learned that like to be Hmong, it means one generation will come a time for one generation to literally sacrifice themselves so that the next generation can live. So it's this whole idea that in death there's new life. And I ask myself, like, one day my generation is going to be asked to say, like, because my parents' generation, some of them literally put their lives down to get us here to America. And then what's my generation? What are we going to have to sacrifice? And then we get to be the steward of this. So when somebody comes up to me and asks me, like, oh yeah, like cheeseburger egg rolls, pretty cool, huh, dude? Like that's the cool thing, right? Well, I'm like, that's great, and no knock on that. But ask yourself, like, how did this egg roll came to be? Like, let's follow that story. Let's unravel that story. Or even like the calabaos, where Mecca was over and we were making the steamed buns. Like how that came to be. My mom's steamed bun, it was her way of taking care of her kids while they were in college. The mom could make those, freeze them, and we could take it to college and these, thaw them out and then keep us, and then we would have something to eat. She was so afraid that we would have nothing to eat and she couldn't go to college with us. That's what she did. So literally these steamed buns, like we can argue till we're blue in the face and anybody can fight me about, oh, that's not the right style or that's the blah, 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 blah. I don't give a crap what you think. But what it is a mother taking care of her boys when they went off to college and she couldn't be there anymore. And so she used what was around her. So we had ground pork, we had glass noodles, we had cabbage, and then she would put a boiled egg, like a hard boiled egg inside. Why? Because it had more sustenance in there because we didn't have a lot of ground pork. See, that's the story. That's Hmong in any way. Anybody want to fight me on that? That's Hmong. That's not a trend. See, Mom wasn't trying to figure out this trend to be like, oh, what's going to be cool, and then what can the food influencers take pictures of, and how can we, get many likes? And it's like she didn't care about that. She was taking care of her kids. That's it. And so I think that I get why these trends happen because people are curious. But I'll take curiosity over people who are like, nah, whatever, this is stupid, I don't want this. I'll take curiosity over that. If you give me an inch on that, I'll show you the mile, I'll show you the road. And so I see ourselves as stewards of this food. I see ourselves that one day I want to teach some young Hmong kids to understand this. So one day, then when it comes for them, and if it's their turn to take up, I want to hand the mantle over, because this is not mine. Because before I got here, there was many generations before me that got me here. And so that's one of the things I love it. Like, I don't care about trends, but I'll take it. I'll embrace it. You know, like the two words I get so fired up about this is the two words of authenticity and traditional. Because we get pooped on a lot the Hmong people who are the hardliners that says, oh, your food you're making, it's not traditional Hmong food. You know, it's not traditional. It's, you know, you're not using the right knife or the right cutting board, or this is not what you made. Of course it's not, if you want to talk about that, but we extract from the traditions that make us who we are. And I don't see traditional versus, I don't look at it as traditional versus authenticity. I look at two words that can live together in the same space. We're authentically Hmong because we're Hmong, and we pull from our traditions to create new traditions. And so that's why I'm not afraid of trends. Like, trends will come and go. Like, I'll tell people, you know, trends come and go, and that's awesome. Great. And there's going to be some young cook that's going to make something that has the essence of foam or blah, 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 whatever they want to do. But at the end of the day, like, we're going to stick to the story, and I'm going to teach you, and I'm going to tell you the depth behind the story of the food.
Absolutely. And yeah, very good comments in the chat section. Just, yeah, as to all of that. And it got my mind thinking, when y'all were talking about the heritage of food and how heritage is maintained, y'all were talking about your grandparents, your mothers, your uncle helping you in the kitchen or introducing you to the food. It also got me thinking of Resmaa Menakem, My Grandmother's Hands, which was talking more about the trauma and the way it lives in our body, but also what about the My Grandmother's Hands, the food and what she's prepared and how they've nurtured us and carried us through turmoil and through starvation and through hard times, which was, yeah, that was just something that came to mind from that. And we've kind of touched on this and answered it through our last discourse, but if you have any other thoughts about how heritage is maintained through food, is it just the story, or what kind of ingredients, like how does it go down to the ingredient that maintains heritage and culture?
I think,
No, you go ahead.
I think a lot about my parents and my grandparents and the really big meals we used to have together when I was growing up, and how they would work sometimes in leaner times. You would make things stretch. And I think a lot about those traditional foods that we see, like migas and chilaquiles have become like super duper popular on menus, but it's like, that's some old tortillas that were like, you know, you fried them up, you cooked them up, they were leftover tortilla chips. You know, you're making really incredible food with not a lot, because a lot of the like chiles and salsas, that like the sauces that are going on top of that, sometimes it's like a few chili peppers in like water or broth or something, like really, really stretching these things. And you're getting the base of the ingredients is really, really prevalent, because you're working with a few items. You know, you're roasting a pepper, you're bringing out its deeper, more bitter, rich flavors, you're blending it up with like a little bit of stock or a little bit of broth. And that's kind of what I think about, like we survived for years this way with fewer items. So I think of, again, like pre-colonial diet in Mexico, lots of beans, corn, squash, very similar to like North America. Lots of indigenous people ate that way. And sometimes there'd be meat and sometimes there wouldn't be. And I think of, I'm personally trying to find ways to incorporate more of that pre-colonial cooking into my diet by consuming less meat. And when I do, it's like more thoughtful, or like poultry, or something that's definitely, you know, I don't know, not as like, I don't know, you think of like cows and I don't know, big factory farmed animals. But either way, just how to get closer to that food that sustained my family and my family's family before that. And sometimes I'm at home and I make like tostadas, very simple. I take like Nixta tortillas, by the way, some of the best tortillas, so flavorful. That I love Gustavo and what he's doing. And again, reclaiming these foodways with the corn, these heritage corn, the flavors, the color, the smell, and the texture of them are absolutely beautiful. And I feel like there's nothing wrong with like a really delicious like La Perla tortilla, but there's something different about holding this heritage grain tortilla and like smelling it and holding it and sliding some like really nice beans on it and keeping it very simple and really enjoying that on a deeper level. Like the sounds I make when I'm eating a really good tostada with like Rancho Gordo beans, like these very small, like, you know, working with small batch, like small farmers in Mexico and California. It's incredible. And sorry, I feel like I'm getting off topic here, but that to me is like reconnecting with those older food patterns in a way and stretching it for survival and like being hella grateful to the family that came before me that that got me here so that I could enjoy this in a way, and grateful to the farmers and the people that are maintaining access to these old grains and beans and that kind of stuff.
I'll just say, you know, as far as heritage foods go, you know, as Indigenous peoples on a global scale, like we have so many commonalities with how we treat our food systems, and we have so many specialty foods that really represent who we particularly are. And even though many of us have gone through in history, very violent histories, you know, in the United States, for Indigenous peoples, like a lot of us were completely removed from our food systems. We were pushed into areas that we weren't from. We were stripped completely of our own foodways. A lot of tribes lost the seeds that they were growing. And you know, and that was just very recently. And even, you know, in the 1900s, like we weren't even legally able to practice our own religions until 1978. So there was just a lot of real danger of incarceration and violence and even death by sharing some of these foodways, because it's part of our education system, it's part of our knowledge system, it's part of our religion, it's part of everything. And, you know, a lot of our foods for a lot of communities started, or a lot of our education started to become very secretive in a lot of different Indigenous communities because of that very real threat. But, you know, we've slowly been able to really start to have conversations to start to reclaim our Indigenous foodways, to start to really reconnect and start to erase a lot of these colonial borders of what is the US, Mexico, Canada here in North America, and start to really think about the true Indigenous diversity that's out there, you know, because in North America, you just federally recognized tribes. There's 574 in the US, 622 in Canada, and Mexico there's 20% of Mexico identifies as Indigenous in one way or another. So there's so much Indigenous diversity across the board in just this one continent. And then you bring in the whole world cuisine to that. And there's so much that we can be bringing together. And, you know, it's hard because of the colonial machine that happened to, especially us as Black and Indigenous in the United States. But there's ways for us to take the time to start to re-identify, to start to reclaim, to start to push against the colonial structure that's been against us, and start to celebrate a lot of these foods, you know, and start to really, you know, do something different and really showcase and allow us to be able to tell these stories through these foods, you know, and reconnect with something that our ancestors had. So that I feel like there's definitely paths out of this colonial structure, and it's totally doable. And food is that way, but it's also this thing that really connects us as people, you know. And obviously, no offense to people of European descent, because we all have lots of European descendant friends out there. And you know, I love French food, I love Italian food and such, but there's also a lot of history we have to deal with. You know, we can find a lot of Italian restaurants, we can find a lot of French restaurants, and we all speak English, which is a foreign language, you know, and we're here doing that. So, you know, we have to just really kind of rethink things. But again, this is kind of an exciting time, I think, and also a crazy time, because some parts of the United States are reverting. They're starting to re-whitewash history. They're starting to make it more difficult. They're starting to put up more barriers for people of color. And it's going to be a constant struggle, which is why we all have to stop siloing, like Mecca and I talk about a lot, and really bind together, because we are all in this together. And the more we support each other, the bigger we're going to grow.
Yeah, with what Sean just said about siloing, because, before I got together with Sean, I was mostly concerned with Black foodways. And then I got together with Sean. It was just so instantly ridiculous to me that I wasn't also focused on Indigenous cuisine with my work. It just was just like this. It was just like a flashpoint. Like, how can I do any of this work without thinking about Indigenous cuisine or Indigenous people? And then I just thought there's no real reason to leave anybody of color out of these conversations. And that's why we formed BIPOC Foodways Alliance. I've always covered all of these communities, but I think coming together is really where it's at. I think there's strength in numbers and so powerful. And I think that communities of color have been kept separate, really siloed in the United States for good reason, because it's too powerful, it's too scary. But Sean just dropped a lot of knowledge. And so I'm just going to bring it back to like on a personal tip. As far as like heritage and tradition, I'm a mixed race. And so I grew up with the white side of my family, and I had access to both of my grandmothers on that side. And I learned, some really fun and interesting European cooking that way. And I didn't have access to my Black grandmothers for a variety of reasons, but some of it having to do with white supremacy and family secrets and adoption and all the bureaucracy that comes with that. And so now, as a grown woman, attempting to have a food identity, I'm separated from that side of my heritage. And so it's like a lifelong process for me to try and reclaim that. And so not having access to just my Black grandmother cuts me off from the history of that cuisine. And so that just goes to show you like how important that is. And I'd say Yia is a wonderful example of what if Yia didn't have access to his mom and his dad, and what that would mean for him carrying on his legacy. So I think it's extremely important.
Yeah. Any other thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, I just want to throw real quick out, that word heritage it's very important to me. And I think that in the last year, I learned a lot about what it meant. I remember, in college, I went, my buddies and we go to their house. They lived out in Hudson. And I remember we were driving to his house, and I was looking at the street, and I'm like, dude, the street's is the same last name as the street name is your last name. And he's like, oh yeah, my great grandparents' farm is here, and then the city bought it, and then a few of the this used to be their land, blah blah blah, and all that stuff. And I remember I left that experience going, dude, my parents don't have anything here that they can hand down to us. There's it was so crazy. I remember in college where my buddy's like, oh yeah, my parents' will, our parents have this will, or our grandparents in their will, blah blah blah. And I'm like, wait, we don't have that in our culture. That's such a new concept to the Hmong people. The idea of being able to write a will, oh, this is my assets and I can pass it down to my, to my family, because they came here with nothing and they had nothing. And I think for a while I struggled with that, well, what happens? And when I really studied the word heritage, what literally means is you can trace the DNA, you can trace it from generation to generation, and it's not tainted. And then you can go back to the original, and it's exactly the same as it was in the original. It dawned upon me, and as I looked at my brothers and sisters, my siblings, I'm like, we're their heritage. We're what's being passed down. So everything, all their knowledge that they have, we get to embrace it, and then we get to pass it down to our kids, and they get to pass it down to their kids, so it's not stuff, and it's so much, and so much of it comes about, it revolves around food. One of the greatest travesty that I've learned within the Hmong community is the loss of the Hmong language. And with the loss of the Hmong language, so these grandmas and moms can't communicate with these, with their children and their grandchildren on how to make these things. So, because in our culture, we're an oral culture. So it wasn't until the 1950-ish, that's when our written language was created. And when if you know anything about history, the moment you have your own writing, or it's no longer, because our elders, they are our elders, they're like our historical archives. And if you think about it in a computer standpoint, right, are all these historical hard drives, as our elders are passing away and moving on, it's crashing, and we don't. So our history is literally dying off. And so how important is it for us to start documenting things? That's why I appreciate so much what Mecca, and what they're doing is they're documenting this thing. I think it was like the first time my mom was able to speak and talk and show how to make these steam buns. And like, it was so special for her because, mom was actually even talking to me about it. She goes, I have never really written down like how many ounces of dough to use until like Mecca, until you guys came over, and they like, it blew their mind where it's like, oh, it's 7 ounces. It's 7 ounces. Like that's the dough. Like before, it used to be my mom would be like, it's this, and now they're like, they have something that's written down. They have an archive. They have a document. They have a video that they can look to. And so that part is like so important, and that's what's so important to me, and like that's what I hold really tight when I think about heritage, and I think about how do we pass things down.
Absolutely, and it is kind of
Totally.
mind-blowing. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just, I mean, you hit a lot of the stuff I was going to say about oral history specifically, and then writing can be such a tool for passing this down. Like, this is our legacy. Because, like Mecca was saying before, before I came across Mecca's work, or before I came across like Soleil Ho's work, I didn't quite know, like, oh, like a brown non-binary femme person could be writing about food. Like, I have this passion for it. And I think about the story of your mom writing down the recipes, similar one with my abuelita with her flour tortillas, like never written down. And my dad actually texted me for that recipe recently, which I have somewhere in the cabinet. But I mean, speaking of my dad, the last time I saw him cry was like him being excited about the writing that I'm doing, because I'm the grandchild of immigrants, and he never thought that we would see us having any kind of platform, or like, to have any kind of way to share our culture, our heritage in this way, was really powerful. So again, like, writing is this really fantastic tool for creating access for many people, whether that's people who look like us from our background, or again, just like not siloing it between other BIPOC people, or creating access for those people who are genuinely curious and don't want our cuisine to just be a fad, or they try something and they're very interested in that allows them in. So I just wanted to jump in and say, like, as you noted, writing is this powerful piece for all of this.
Absolutely, and it's kind of weird how we disassociated ourselves from history and being history. Like, we are history. We're writing history. We're living history. Even as young people of color existing in this day and age, documenting our experiences and just kind of existing and following our interests and our passions, which will open it up for the next generation as well. And I will ask one more question, and then we can open it up to Q&A. Luke, I see you have a question in the chat as well. So yeah, we'll definitely get some questions and answers going here. But that all made me think about, like Mecca was talking about, BIPOC foodways. So yeah, what am I thinking? So, how cultures come together in very different ways, and how can we bridge our experiences, but also appreciate our differences. And it got me thinking about just the way foods have come together from different cultures to try and bridge cultures. So I'm thinking of like concha burger. I'm thinking of Ethiopian birria. I'm thinking of soul food egg rolls. Pho has become really, really popular, especially in the cold states and Midwest. But even me, I don't know if I'm prepared to eat a tripe pho or anything like that. But I'm definitely down to eat a good chicken pho, or like, keep it to brisket and flank. But still, like, seeing it on the menu. And I was at a Chinese restaurant the other night and they had chitlins on the menu. Like, what? That blew my mind. That's kind of what you're saying. fried chicken is in every culture. Like, of course, chitlins would be in other cultures too. Like, we're not the only people that use snout to tail kind of methodology, especially growing up. So yeah, fried bread tacos, I even wrote down, like, just all the way let these food and cultures come together. But yeah, how can we use food as a tool to bridge BIPOC cultures in fun ways, like, you know, like we just said, concha burgers and fried bread tacos, and in really respectful and meaningful ways?
I'll just say that obviously, you know, some of the stuff that we're doing this summer, just bringing people together and just having a big dish, you know, like just bringing, we just had this massive paella pan, and we just like started like with this wild rice kind of base with all these veggies and things. And then people started bringing in stuff and bringing in sauces and bringing in things. And I think it's fun to be able to, you know, bring things that are special to us that we have stories about that we can share with each other and taste together and literally sit down and ingest together, you know. And I just think that there's you know, when we're thinking about Indigenous peoples, that when we're thinking about people of color, we should be thinking about, again, like people who have been affected by colonialism on this global scale, because it's a thing, you know, it's something that happened to so many of our communities and cultures from all these different regions of the world. And we carry so many commonalities, and we break down what are our true food systems. You know, many of us had a lot of agriculture, many of us had a lot of, all of us had a vast knowledge of wild plants around us and the foods that were natural to the regions that we're particularly from. And all the different very elemental cooking techniques that we came up with earth cooking and pottery, and, you know, just cooking things very elementally in that sense, and just letting food be really what it is, but also just, you know, processing this food in a very real way. A lot of really creative methods of food preservation. And we just have so many amazing diverse flavors, and we should all be embracing that diversity instead of trying to homogenize it all the time and try to squish it all into one thing. We should be really celebrating all this amazing diversity. Again, because, like, you know, there's so much indigenous diversity in Mexico alone, you know, and people just equate all Mexican food. They put it all under one thing, you know, but we should be really looking at all the different regional and cultural differences. And the same thing with the United States. We should be looking at all of that, and we should be including all of these pieces of all these people of color that we have around us and all their histories and how we've all woven together, you know, as American people here in modern day America, you know. And there's just so much that we can reclaim and so much that we can share, but we need to have more conversations like this, and we need to do this in person, so we can all be eating together, you know, and cooking together and sharing together, because that's really where it's all about, you know, because even this is a bit of a disconnect when we can't really be in the same place together. So, but food is something that is really meant to share, and it's meant to nourish, and we should be really eating healthy foods. And, you know, sure, if you want to make some crazy cheeseburger out of 1,000 cultures or whatever, I think it's doable. But as long as people are together and having real conversations, I think that's where it's at.
Yeah, when I'm out and about and networking and chatting with people about the BIPOC Foodways Alliance work, and sometimes I get pushback, and people will say, well, you know, so many communities are just still trying to reclaim their own sovereignty, you know, particularly like with Indigenous people, and trying to, you know, trying to embrace their own heritage and such. And I say that's wonderful and that's great. I also think we can do both things at once. I don't think it has to be an either or situation. And so I think with, and personally, like I've had the great privilege over the last couple of decades to be, you know, be able to move through all these different cultural food experiences and, you know, share food with people and get told stories and retell those stories and eat all this food. And sometimes I find it just a little bit disturbing. Like if I go to an event that's, you know, where it's soul food, for just using that as an example, and it's only Black people, or if I go to an Indigenous event, it's only Indigenous people. And I think, like, why aren't we all more coming together and having curiosities about each other? And so that's really something that I really hope for. And I think curiosity is really the key. And like what Yia talks about, and Yia and I have had some great conversations over the years about this, but not just, like we said, not just stopping with the food, because yeah, the food, it tastes great, you know, and that's wonderful. But if we really need to go deeper than just like extracting someone's recipe and I love what, so you has been doing some really interesting work lately about like, no, I'm not going to share necessarily a recipe with you, because then you might just take that home, cook that recipe and stop there. What we need is to be cooking together, eating together, telling stories together, having conversations together, and really trying to understand one another. And food is the perfect tool for that, so long as we don't just stop with the recipe or stop with the Instagram or stop with the fast food that we want to be so cheap and accessible to us, and then have that and throw away the takeout container and forget about it. So I think food is the perfect tool, because we all got to eat, we all love doing it. But it's a matter of like going deeper than that, and really like trying to share space, be communal. And so that's what I want my life's work to be about, because I think that there shouldn't be any limitations with that. Sky's the limit, I think.
Yeah, and kind of going off of Mecca there, like I think that when it comes to this kind of diversity of food, it's a lot about listening, right? So don't get me wrong, and I'm not bashing on my white brothers and sisters here, but the moment they hear that I'm like Hmong, and usually the next line is, oh, like where were you born? And I have to go through this whole history of like, okay, so technically I was born in Thailand, because there's a refugee camp, was after this war. But then all they hear is Thailand, and like, dude, I love pad thai. And I'm like, okay, you didn't hear what I said. Or I was like, oh my gosh, like I did like 2 weeks in Bangkok. It was awesome, beautiful, beautiful area. And one of the things I started noticing is like, dude, just listen first, and I learned a lot of that by, like Gustavo is a good buddy of mine. And every time we hang out, we cook together, I'm always like, bro, that like the way that we do food, like, Mexican food from where he's from and Hmong food where I'm from, we're like weird cousins, because it's like, you have a different name, like you have a different name for your mole, but like to us, that's a curry we use, but just in those intermingling, and how it's like, we are actually closer than we think. And it was because it's like taking a pause and listening, it wasn't about, finding, my buddy who, Jabba, who's, Ethiopian, and he's, he starts talking about, Ninjera, and I just go, oh my gosh, like, oh, I had this one place, it was so great. It's like, dude, when I'm talking, I'm not listening to you. I'm not truly listening to where you're coming from. I'm not truly listening to your food, to the stories of your food. And I think that that's one of the greatest lessons I've learned, is just listen. Just listen first before you want to interject, because I think naturally as humans, we want to connect, right? So what's the next thing we do? We always try to say something that connects us. And I get it a lot, especially when I say, hey, I was born in Thailand. And then it's just like, oh, let me tell you about my college trip I took to Thailand in Bangkok back in '95. And it was amazing. But it's like, dude, you heard one word, try to connect with me, which again, like it's not malice, it's not whatever, but it's just this urge to connect, because there's insecurities in that, because you look different, I look different, I want to connect, I want us to not make this space to be so weird. But in that moment of trying to connect, which comes out of great intentions, you miss everything because you're not listening. And that's why I believe that food is a universal language we can use to speak to each other. I believe that when I'm in an area where I have no idea, like if, especially like with Middle Eastern food, like if you go to Liberia or, or if you go to, Lebanon or something, sorry, not Liberia, Lebanon, and you get to that food, I have no idea what it is, but I would love to listen. I would love to sit and talk, and I would love to hear these food stories, And so the first and foremost, the biggest thing I've learned is just sit and listen.
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add, especially after Yia's thoughts on listening to one another, or like looking for the commonality and then saying why it's important. Like there are definitely some cuisines that I really enjoy, because although they're not my culture, they make me interested in somebody else's culture because the flavors remind me of my own. Again, coming back to Soleil Ho, they used to have a podcast called Grace's Sandwich. And for some reason, there's an episode that's like stuck in my head where one of the guests who was Indian American, his parents were immigrants from India. They moved to Arizona and became very close friends with their Mexican neighbors because a lot of the like acid and chilies and cumin and stuff that was used in their food allowed them to kind of find solace in one another in a relatively like what they described as like kind of cowboy, like you know, I don't know, a little, it was just like not always super welcoming to them, but they created or they found a commonality and community through food. And I think of that a lot. And then also this question particularly, Sarah, the name of the podcast is called Racist Sandwich. And then in the first episode, they go into the meaning of that name. It's a very good podcast. I think they're still making it, but it has a different name now, and Soleil is not involved anymore. But this also makes me think of a book that I was gifted a while ago from my partner that I can't believe I haven't read it. I think we moved, but it is called You and I Eat the Same. It's on the countless ways food and cooking connects us to one another. And when we moved, and I'm like, oh, I have this book, I should really read it. But it seems very in line with kind of everything that we're talking about here as well. Yeah, so I don't know. Those are my two, like, I guess, contributions for content that have to do with this as well.
Perfect. Thank you. And yeah, if you have any questions, just drop them in the chat. We'll try and get to as many of them as we can in the next few minutes here. And MV, I think that's what it said. Argentinian stroganoff. Don't know what that means, but it sounds delicious. Just have to say. So yeah, from Luke, how as chefs do you ignite the idea of trends into a revolution of understanding and growth? Is one question that I've seen in the chat.
I'll say that I think that Ian and I have kind of moved in very similar ways with some of the cultural recovery. Or just, introducing our foods, not only to the world, but to our own communities when it comes down to it, and really identifying and, what are traditional versus modern foods as we're moving into these different ways and identifying that and sharing those pieces. But I feel that I feel like for me, it's been really important to identify the privilege of having this platform, to be able to have this exposure, to have the media ask questions, to be invited to speak. And instead of just going and telling people how to make a fry bread taco, obviously there's a lot more to it. And, I really try hard to utilize this platform with a lot of integrity and a lot of value, and really share things that are really important and really address things that need to be changed, and just really focus on, what could I be speaking to this audience about? What could I be telling people? And so for me, I think, it's different because it becomes something that's not just about myself. And I feel like he is in that same thing where this food isn't just about him as a chef. It's not about becoming the celebrity persona. It's about really bringing something to the world that helps our cultures, so I feel very lucky that I get the attention that I get, but I try to, again, be really intentional about, making sure that I'm using this platform very carefully.
Yeah, I think kind of going off of that, thank you, Sean. Your words are so kind. But I kind of going off on that, and one of the things that I always get, kind of categorized in, or what we're doing gets categorized in, goes, hey, you guys are really elevating Hmong food. And that always rubs me the wrong way when they say elevating. And when I say they, I mean my own people, because our own people have been, the Hmong people have been, we have this thing within, it's kind of like family talk, because like you gotta, only when you're in the community you understand what it's, and within the Hmong community there's always this thing of like, we're not legit until the majority culture dubs us worthy. So like a lot of the things that we do in our culture tries to like get the eyes of national or world recognition, and it's, so we've been very blessed to be highlighted by certain medias and blah 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 and all that stuff. And the thing that I always get is people, our community would always say, hey, thank you for elevating our Hmong food, making elevated Hmong food. And I guess one day I just had it. And I'm like, no. I'm like, don't you dare call the food that we're making elevated, because long before, eater.com did anything for us, or James Beard or whatever, like, this is the food that fed us growing up. Mom worked hard, dad worked hard to get this food on the table. And I'm not going to look at the stuff they made, the curries they made, the stews they made. I'm not going to look at that and go, oh, well, mom and dad, that was so long time ago, but I'm going to make it better. No, not absolutely. I get to stand on the shoulders of giants. So it's not elevating, it's illuminating. It's always been elevated, but the problem is, like, mainstream America is not willing to pay what's worth. So they want $5.99 with a fortune cookie at the end, and they won't pay any more than that. It irritates me when people come to Hmong Village and say, oh my gosh, it's the cheapest eats. How dare you? Do you know how much more hours that family has to hustle in that stall, because they can't make it more, they can't price it beyond $10, because then what that means is people will stop coming. Like, to me, this stuff has already been elevated, and I get the opportunity, I get the blessing to be able to illuminate it.
Absolutely.
Because I've been very blessed to be in this platform that other, and I speak this from the Hmong view, other Hmong, vendors and operators who had to make Chinese food or had to make Asian fusion food. So then they are the trailblazers that I get to stand on, and so I'm very clear that we, like, even to my own community, I'll say to my own community, don't you dare call this elevated Hmong food. I'm not elevating anything. I'm illuminating what's always been here. And it's always, when I talk to my Hmong brothers and sisters, I'm always saying, if you come alongside us, we've been worthy. We don't have to seek worthiness. We've been worthy.
Absolutely.
Why the frickin' 1955, the Hmong, like the U.S. government was the one who came to the hills of Laos to hire out our parents and our grandparents to fight for them as troops in the mountains in the secret war, because we were the toughest guys up there. And so that's one thing that, especially for younger, I saw some questions about, how are you talking to the younger generation? That's one thing I keep reminding them, that we've always been here, and now we have the opportunity to show the world.
Yeah, I've always learned about the power of language and just connotation and all that. And I like what you said, that you're illuminating, not elevating, because elevating typically makes attractive to a white audience. So this plate looks good so that people will be more willing to eat it, as opposed to just serving it how it is and how it should be. And yes, correct. There is more questions about youth. Kristen says she worked with a high school class in Columbia Heights and had them take pictures of their food and displayed it in the hall, had them do some writing about the food. So how are you connecting with young people on these topics? And then another question surrounding youth. What can the rising generation of BIPOC youth do to support the resurgence of BIPOC perspectives in food? So yeah, any thoughts about youth and food ways and how you're working with them and how you can reclaim them? Yeah, I know you hired a bunch of Hmong youth to work at the state fair with Union Hmong Kitchen. But yeah, Becca, is there ways you're working with youth as well, and with the schools and et cetera?
I'm gonna let somebody else take this one.
I'll go. So, some of the work that I'm doing with the nonprofit I created, which is NATIFS, that's an acronym, North American Traditional Indigenous Food Systems. And we have our space in Midtown Global Market called Indigenous Food Lab. But we are just about ready to launch a native market space where there's going to be a spot for people to come and find native food product that we're curating from native producers all over the nation, and be able to have a space where people can just come find a whole bunch of interesting products. And there'll also be a small space there for people to order just some stuff, just like all the other stalls in Midtown Global. But the other piece is that our nonprofit is focused on two principles, which is creating access to Indigenous foods and creating access to Indigenous education. So for me, it was really identifying what Indigenous education meant, which was just basically the thousands of generations of knowledge that we should have been downloading and absorbing as Indigenous peoples and communities. which because of history was replaced with a colonial assimilation education, which was basically American education, what we all grew up with today. And then so we're also alongside this market space opening up a classroom, a community classroom, so we can teach about Indigenous foodways, and we can utilize a lot of community members to offer whatever they want to offer and create a space where they can get paid to teach and to share. Because the goal is to steward all of this stuff through video. So everything that we do, we record and we share it. So we're going to be creating a whole bunch of curriculum for Indigenous peoples for all ages, for youth all the way through adults, and creating systems for them to learn about all facets of Indigenous education, which is cooking techniques and food preservation and wild food and plant identification and language and history and crafting, music, you name it. Like we have so much education as Indigenous peoples on a global scale, but we're just looking at the commonalities and breaking that down. So we're working with lots of school systems. We're working with lots of universities. We're doing one project where we're actually, there's a school in Pine Ridge, South Dakota called Red Cloud. It was the very first Pine Ridge Indian boarding school that my grandparents had to go to. And they decided that they no longer wanted to follow the USDA recommended lunch program, basically, because they're a private school and they had the power to do that. So they reached out, and we're helping them to set up systems where they can start to put Indigenous foods back into their school system diet and utilize it as an educational piece, because they also have a small garden on site there, and they're doing a lot of stuff to really push forward. And we're just doing everything we can through our nonprofit to utilize this as a pilot program to show what's possible, like changing over an entire school food program, and getting them to start cooking things from scratch a little bit more, and giving them the resources they need to be able to do that, both educationally and materially. We're actually helping supply them with some of the physical kitchen equipment too, so they can actually pull that off. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, because really the youth is where it's at. The youth are the ones that we have to set up for. Everything that I see, everything I feel like I'm doing is just setting up for that generation, so they don't have to struggle as hard or move as hard to be able to do this work, that they'll have some foundation set up for them that they can take and run, and hopefully be way bigger than I can ever be when it comes down to it. So a lot of this work for me is all about the next generation.
Absolutely. And Appetite for Change, we used to say the youth are the truth, and that's why we're here and that's what we do it for. Before we go, I just want to remind people about the writing workshops that we have in contingency, is that the word? And congruency, I don't know, in relation to this panel conversation. They're on the website, More Than a Single Story. One is led by Mecca and one is led by Natalia. So they're very, very, very strong writers, and just more access to these conversations and how to write about them and how to expose them and bring them to our own families, our friends, our schools, our spaces. And also please take the survey. Kia's dropped a survey link a couple times. It's very helpful for More Than a Single Story, as well as the Hennepin County Libraries, just to get feedback and just to hear affirmations and anything you liked or loved or would have loved to see differently. That's all super, super welcome. We know we all love sending out surveys, but not doing surveys, but we would love if you took our survey. On that note, look out for the writing workshops. Look out for the survey. Please fill out the survey. If you had more questions that we weren't able to get to, please just send an email. We can get it to the right person, or just go through their websites and, of course, follow them on Instagram, social media, and all that good stuff. Thank you all. Carolyn/Grandma, is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yes, I am Tessa's very proud grandma. I just want to thank everyone again for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation. We recorded it, and it'll be on More Than a Single Story and Hennepin County Library's websites in the next few days. And hopefully we'll be able to include some of the resources that our panelists mentioned. Also, their websites are in the chat if you want to learn more about them or contact them. So thank you again for coming, and eat well.
Yeah, good stuff. All right,
Mhm.
thank you all. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.